Something unusual is happening today. For the first time since the FTX collapse, Bitcoin is beginning to show a negative correlation to the S&P 500. What we can see in the short term is that Bitcoin is up, the orange line, we're moving up as the S&P is moving down. We do have a short-term decoupling taking place. If you look throughout history, Bitcoin is almost always positively correlated to the S&P, but sometimes there are moments where we have a short-term decoupling, and that could be what's taking place right now. So let's discuss that in today's video. What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Svenson, and today we're going to be discussing the price of Bitcoin and its relation to the stock market, which is taking an interesting turn. But even though Bitcoin is decoupling from the stock market in the short term, I still think the stock market's going to play a big role in what Bitcoin does next. So on this chart, what you see is the S&P, the candles, Bitcoin in orange, and the correlation coefficient tool in blue. That's the indicator on the bottom. The correlation coefficient shows either a positive correlation or a negative correlation between Bitcoin and the S&P. So that's what we're looking at now. On this topic of the stock market, first of all, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you're new. On this topic, we've talked about this a lot on this channel. Very extensively, we've discussed the correlation of Bitcoin and the S&P. Now, every time Bitcoin has a short-term decoupling, as we're seeing right now, you can see Bitcoin's up as the S&P is down. What most people do, most Bitcoin fanatics, they just jump to the conclusion that we've decoupled, we're no longer going to follow the stock market ever again, and all traders are just going to ignore the stock market and never look at it again, and Bitcoin's on its own. Well, I don't think that's the case. Every time someone has claimed that there's a decoupling in Bitcoin history, it has only been temporary. And I don't think this time is any different. As much as I would love for Bitcoin to just break away and never, correlate to anything ever again, we know that's not the case. I mean, people are trading Bitcoin against the dollar. So there is always going to be some kind of correlation as long as people trade Bitcoin against fiat currencies, right? We price Bitcoin in fiat. So the correlation will always be there. So I think that Bitcoin is going to remain generally correlated to the US stock market, but there is one factor that could help Bitcoin start to become a little bit less correlated over time, right? Again, there's no such thing as an instant decoupling, but the one thing right here, guys, Bitcoin is becoming increasingly correlated with the Chinese stock market, which is entering a bull market. This is one of the factors that could potentially play a role in getting Bitcoin to have somewhat more unique price action against the stock market if the influence from another major nation, such as China, starts to take more of a hold of Bitcoin's trends. That's when we could start to see things change. But there's not enough data yet to suggest that. But it is possible that the decoupling that we're seeing right now could have something to do with this. So I'm keeping my mind open. I'm not 100%, on one side or the other. I do believe strongly in my analysis, but this is something to consider. The confidence of traders will always be affected by the stock market, right? So in my mind, I'll go ahead and just say it. There's no such thing as a long-term decoupling unless it's proven over the period of years. You can't go based on a day. I know this is kind of an unpopular opinion. You guys kind of just want me to say Bitcoin's on its own now and it doesn't correlate to the stock market, but that's just not the case. So we have a short-term decoupling. The last time that this happened was the FTX collapse. This is the S&P and Bitcoin side by side since actually over here in 2021. Now you can see that there are moments in time where there's a short-term, a negative correlation where Bitcoin is kind of doing its own thing. If you look at the correlation coefficient tool, that's the indicator on the bottom, we've had multiple of these in the past couple of years. And when they happen, usually it's that Bitcoin is actually decoupling to the downside. When this has happened in the past, like this zone here, when we had a negative correlation, what was Bitcoin doing? It was actually coming down as the S&P was going up. That was a decoupling in the wrong direction. And if we go over here to this zone, Bitcoin had a negative correlation to the S&P. Why? Well, right here, we had Bitcoin coming down as the S&P was going up. Now, the next time you look at this chart, right here, we had a negative correlation. Why? Because Bitcoin was going down after the FTX collapse and the S&P was going up. So Over the past 2 years, every negative correlation that we've seen was a result of Bitcoin going down against the S&P, the exact opposite of what people would want, right? But it's interesting to see that today we're starting to see a little bit, just a little bit of a negative correlation. Bitcoin's going up as the S&P is coming down. So that is very interesting. Does this area on the chart right here prove, this little move down into the negative zone, does this prove that Bitcoin has now decoupled forever? Absolutely not. This is something that I'm seeing on Twitter already, and it's kind of just funny to see people talking like that. It's always short term. Most of the time, Bitcoin is in the positive correlation zone with the vast majority of the time. So this move here, people have been asking me about it. Yeah, it's nice to see. It means that right now, Bitcoin has had such a terrible last year, and we had the FTX collapse, which pushed the price even further down. Now what I think is happening is we're seeing some of that demand for Bitcoin come back into the market and stay in the market regardless of what the stock market's doing. And I think that that is only a short-term event. It's unlikely that, let's say the S&P has a really bearish move where we break back below the year-long downtrend line, and then we confirm essentially that it's a false breakout and that we're back below the downtrend line. If that occurred, it's very likely that traders are going to see that and not be so confident anymore, right? And then they're going to also start to sell or try to short. The only way there can really be a decoupling is if all Bitcoin traders just stop looking at the stock market, completely just ignore it. Do you think that's going to happen? Well, I know you want it to. I want it to. It's just unlikely to. But for the time being, I mean, some of these past correlations here, like if you go back to 2019, for example, we had zones like this area right here where the S&P was coming down and Bitcoin was going up, negative correlation, right? And that was one of the only real times that we had a negative correlation because Bitcoin was bullish. Usually it's the opposite. So keep that in mind. This is one of the rare moments, like in 2019, where the price was just so low that the demand remained high regardless of the stock market dipping. And so we're seeing something very similar right now. The price went so low and there was so much bearishness recently that the demand outweighs the sort of the fear that would occur usually when the stock market pulls back. How long is that going to last? That's the question. A few days, a couple weeks? That's the real question. It's not going to last forever. So what I think is the most likely scenario is that this negative correlation is probably not going to last, and we're going to have to see what happens with the stock market here. If the S&P bounces off the macro resistance as new support, that's going to provide confidence for speculators in the Bitcoin market, and Bitcoin would also start to go up, and then the correlation would go back to positive, right? That's usually what happens. If the S&P ends up breaking below the macro resistance in some sort of major bearish move that confirms that this is a false breakout, I think Bitcoin's going to drop, right? So what we really need here for the bulls is the S&P to confirm the year-long resistance as new support and bounce, and then Bitcoin would rally, continue the rally, and then the correlation would be going back into the positive area. That's actually what I think is most likely. An S&P bounce, Bitcoin continuation, correlation goes back to positive. So that's just my guess. And this is how I analyze these two together. The correlation is usually positive. Any negative correlations don't last very long. And I don't want to provide a fairy tale analysis where, I just say what you want me to say and we're going to decouple forever, because that's what I'm seeing on Twitter, and it's just really disingenuous. And it's just a bunch of hopium, really, that Bitcoin's now decoupled forever. But you never really know. I guess we'll have to see. So that's how I see this. And I think that the analysis that I just provided is the real analysis. It's the most likely one, despite what we want, despite what people want to believe. This is just how it is right now. So I hope to be proven wrong. I hope Bitcoin decouples forever, but it's just not likely. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Smash the like, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you all in the next one.